9:20 am Naval Medical Center San Diego, a morning defined by sterile white walls and endless routine checkups. Petty Officer Sarah Bennett, a Navy hospital corpsman, sits quietly in the exam room. She is just back from a grueling deployment supporting an elite SEAL unit. A doctor glancing at her small 5'4" frame asks with a casual chuckle, "Medic with SEALs, what happened to you out there?" Sarah gives a small tired smile, but as she rolls up her left sleeve for a blood pressure cuff, the room goes silent. Long jagged scars tear across her forearm. Just then Rear Admiral James Carter walks and he sees that Sarah Bennett was a Navy hospital corpsman, but in the unforgiving world of specialized warfare they simply called her Doc. To the average observer at Naval Medical Center San Diego, she looked like any other junior sailor. She was quiet, unassuming, and carried herself with a stillness that many mistook for shyness or lack of confidence. She had spent the last 8 months on the green side, the high-stakes term used for corpsmen who serve alongside combat units like the Marines, or in her case the elite SEAL teams. But her assignment wasn't just any unit. She had been attached to a Tier 1 team in some of the most jagged, airless terrain on the planet. Her job was simple in theory, but near impossible in practice: stay behind the tip of the spear and keep the spear carriers alive. When the world turned to fire, she was trained to perform surgical procedures in the freezing mud to stop catastrophic arterial bleeding while bullets hum like angry bees overhead, and to manage the delicate, terrifying transition from a life-threatening wound to a medical evacuation in the field among the bearded warriors of the teams. She was a goddess of mercy. Back at San Diego, in the cold fluorescent light of the hospital, she was just another number in a long line of personnel awaiting their post-deployment health assessment. The clinic was buzzing with the usual morning energy, the scent of industrial-grade lavender cleaner mixed with the faint aroma of burnt coffee from the break room. Sailors and Marines sat in blue plastic chairs scrolling through their phones or staring blankly at the monitors displaying wait times. Sarah sat near the back, a small manila folder in her lap containing her service record. She felt profoundly out of place. The air here was too clean, the lights were too bright, and the people were too loud about things that didn't matter. Her mind was still drifting back to the high-altitude dust of the Hindu Kush and the way the moonlight hit the jagged ridges before the flares ignited. She could still feel the phantom weight of her trauma bag, the straps digging into her shoulders, a stark contrast to the light clipboard she held now. Petty Officer Bennett, a nurse, called out, checking a clipboard. Without looking up, Sarah stood up, her boots polished, but her mind weary, and followed her into a small sterile exam room. A few minutes later, a young Lieutenant Commander, a primary care doctor named Miller, entered the room with a cheerful, somewhat distracted air. He looked at Sarah's paperwork, adjusted his glasses, and then looked at her with a patronizing tilt of his head. He was a blue-side doctor, someone who spent his days in air-conditioned clinics far from the grid of the front lines. "Welcome back, Bennett," Miller said, clicking his silver pen rhythmically. "It says here you were with a SEAL unit. Rough neighborhood for a rotation. You look a bit small to be carrying those 80-pound trauma bags and keeping up with the frogs, don't you? Did they make you stay in the Tactical Operations Center, or did you actually get some dirt on those boots?" "I imagine it was mostly paperwork and flu shots in the secure zones. It was meant to be light-hearted banter, the kind of casual talk doctors use to fill the silence." But in the hallway, a few other medical staff members leaning against the doorway chuckled seriously. One nurse added, peering in, "Were you really out there in the mountains with them, or were you just running the infirmary back at the forward operating base while the guys did the heavy lifting?" Sarah didn't flinch. She had heard it all before. People saw her height and her quiet demeanor and assumed she was a desk worker or a support staffer who never left the wire. They didn't see the thousands of hours of training, the night spent practicing tourniquet applications in total darkness until her hands bled, or the weight of the absolute responsibility she carried for the lives of men who were considered national assets. She knew that her silence was her strength, but today the hospital's mundanity felt like an insult to the chaos she had just survived. "I was their medic, sir," Sarah replied simply. Her voice was level, devoid of ego or defensive heat. "I went where the mission required the team to go. My size didn't matter when the bleeding had to stop." Miller nodded, still not truly processing the weight of her words. He was thinking about his lunch break and the next 5 patients on his schedule. "Well, let's get through the basics. Blood pressure, heart rate, the usual post-deployment fun. If you'll just pull up that left sleeve for me so we can get a good read." Sarah reached down and unbuttoned her uniform cuff as the heavy digital camouflage fabric slid up past her elbow. The laughter in the hallway died instantly. Lieutenant Commander Miller's hand froze midair, his pen hovering over his chart. Across Sarah's forearm were 3 deep parallel scars. They weren't surgical, they were jagged, raised, and told a vivid story of violent impact and shredded metal. They were the kind of marks that only come from surviving something that should have been fatal. The room felt suddenly very small, the sterile air thickening with a history Miller wasn't prepared to handle. If you think quiet professionals often get overlooked, type, that's unfair. The atmosphere in the exam room shifted from casual to heavy. In a heartbeat, Miller leaned in closer, his professional curiosity finally overriding his earlier skepticism. He looked at the way the skin had knitted together, the way the tissue was slightly discolored from where high-velocity debris had entered and exited. He realized with a start that these weren't just surface wounds, they were deep enough to have compromised everything beneath the skin. "Those aren't from a field accident, Bennett," Miller whispered, his voice losing its edge of humor and being replaced by a tremor of realization. "That looks like high-velocity shrapnel damage, thermal and kinetic. The heat must have been intense. How did you even keep your arm after This, by all accounts, the damage to the radial nerve should have been permanent. It was an incident during an extraction, Sarah said, her voice remaining steady, though her eyes were far away looking through the clinic wall and into a smoking valley. She tried to pull her arm back, wanting to end the scrutiny, but Miller was already reaching for his magnifying lamp, his clinical detachment crumbling. Bennett, these are incredibly deep, Miller noted, his brow furrowing as he checked the range of motion in her wrist. Did you receive proper follow-up for the nerve damage? I don't see a Purple Heart citation or an official injury report in your preliminary folder. This is a massive administrative oversight. Why is this missing? A wound like this requires a board inquiry. I didn't ask for the paperwork, sir, Sarah said, her voice tightening just a fraction. There were others on that bird who needed the attention and the medals more than I did. I just needed to get the wound closed and get back to work. We were short-staffed, and the senior chief was still in critical condition. Medals don't heal patients. At that exact moment, the heavy double doors to the clinic wing swung open. A hush fell over the entire floor as a set of polished black boots clicked rhythmically against the linoleum. Rear Admiral James Carter, the deputy commander of Naval Medical Forces, was conducting a surprise inspection of the post-deployment processing center. He was flanked by a small group of high-ranking officers and a master chief, but his eyes were sharp, scanning every room as he passed, looking for the cracks in the system he had built. He was a man who lived for the details, an old-school officer who valued substance over showmanship. Admiral Carter was a legend in the Navy medical community. He had been a flight surgeon during the Gulf War, jumping into crash sites when he didn't have to, and had spent decades advocating for better armor and psychological support for corpsmen. He believed that the medic was the most important person in any squad because they were the only ones who fought the enemy and death at the same time. He had a reputation for reading every after-action report that crossed his desk, no matter how small. As he passed the open door of Sarah's exam room, he caught a glimpse of the jagged scars under the bright LED lights. He stopped. His staff nearly bumped into his back. Startled by the sudden halt, Carter turned and walked into the small room. Miller snapped to attention so hard his heels clicked, his face drained of color. Admiral, we were just completing a routine assessment for Petty Officer Bennett, sir. Nothing unusual to report. The Admiral didn't look at Miller. He didn't even acknowledge the Lieutenant Commander's presence. He looked at Sarah, then he looked at her name tag. Bennett, he murmured, his eyes narrowing as he accessed a mental database that spanned 40 years of service. He walked closer, his eyes locking onto the scars on her arm. He didn't ask for permission. He reached out and gently took her hand, turning her arm to see the underside where the exit wounds had been. His fingers, calloused and experience, traced the edges of the thick scar tissue. He knew what a direct hit from an RPG looked like up close. He could smell the phantom odor of burnt magnesium and hydraulic fluid just by looking at her. Sarah Bennett, the Admiral said, his voice sounding like heavy gravel. I know that name. I read a report 3 months ago that came across my desk from the Commander of Special Operations Command, a classified report about a doc who refused to let go of a patient's femoral artery even when the extraction bird was taking direct fire, and the cabin was full of smoke. A report that mentioned a corpsman who became a human shield for her patient. The other medical staff in the hallway huddled closer, their eyes wide, as sources the small corpsman they had been joking with 10 minutes ago suddenly seemed to radiate a power that dwarfed everyone in the building. The air in the room felt ionized, charged with the weight of the Admiral's recognition. Admiral, I wasn't supposed to be in the general file. Sarah started, her face flushing with the discomfort of being the center of attention. Be quiet, Petty Officer Carter said, but his tone wasn't harsh. It was filled with a profound, heavy respect that silenced the entire wing. He looked at Miller, his gaze turning icy. Lieutenant Commander, do you have any idea who is sitting in this chair? Do you have any idea what these scars represent in the context of naval history? Do you understand the level of grit required to stay in that seat when the world is exploding around you? Miller swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. She said, it was a field accident, sir. I was just checking for nerve damage. I had no idea she was that doc. A field accident? The Admiral let out a short, bitter laugh that lacked any warmth. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate choice to endure agony for the sake of another life. Petty Officer Bennett, tell them where you were on the night of July 14th. Tell them what happened after the senior chief went down and the world turned red. Sarah looked at the floor. The memories were rushing back. The smell of JP-8 jet fuel, the screaming wind through the open door, the blinding heat of the explosion, and the feeling of her own blood running down her arm and mixing with the blood of the man she was trying to save. If you realize there might be more to her story than she says, type. I was wrong. Admiral Carter turned to the group of doctors, nurses, and hospital corpsmen gathered in the doorway. He didn't wait for Sarah to speak. He knew she wouldn't. He had seen her type before. The quiet professionals who believed that doing their job, no matter the cost, was its own reward. They were the backbone of the service, and they were the ones who rarely complained. 3 months ago, Carter began, his voice projecting throughout the clinic with the authority of a man who had seen too many flag-draped coffins. An extraction helicopter, a modified Black Hawk, was sent into a high-threat zone in a valley no one wants to name to pick up a SEAL team that had been brutally ambushed during a high-value target snatch. They had one critically wounded operator, a senior chief named Vance, with a shattered pelvis and a ruptured femoral artery. He was less than 3 minutes away from bleeding out. The clinic was so silent you could hear the distant hum of the hospital's air conditioning. Petty Officer Bennett was the medic on that bird. Carter continued, his gaze piercing through the staff as they were lifting off, hovering just 6 feet off the deck. The helicopter took a direct hit from an RPG-7. The round didn't take the bird down immediately, but it shattered the side door and sent a spray of white-hot titanium and aluminum through the cabin like a shotgun blast. The Admiral pointed to the scars on Sarah's arm. Sarah was positioned directly over the patient. She was holding manual pressure. Her hands were literally buried in the senior chief's wound, because the tourniquets were failing due to the location of the injury. When the explosion happened, those pieces of the helicopter fuselage ripped through her left arm. It tore the muscle to the bone and severed several minor nerves. He paused, letting the image of the chaos sink in. The pilot through the intercom told SOCOM that he yelled for everyone to get down to seek cover in the center of the airframe because they were taking heavy machine gun fire through the open door. But Sarah Bennett didn't move. She didn't flinch. She knew that if she let go for even 5 seconds to find a bandage for herself or to dive for cover, that senior chief would be dead before they even cleared the ridgeline. She stayed there for 40 minutes of high-velocity flight, holding that man's life in her hands, while her own blood soaked into his uniform and the floorboard. Sarah sat perfectly still in the exam chair, her eyes fixed on a small crack in the tile wall. She could still feel the violent vibration of the helicopter, the way Senior Chief Vance had gripped her hand with a strength born of pure terror, the way she had leaned into his ear and whispered over the roar of the engines that he wasn't going to die today, not on her watch. When they finally landed at the surgical center at Bagram, Carter said, looking Miller straight in the eye until the younger doctor looked away. The trauma surgeons had to physically pry her fingers off the artery. Her hand had cramped into a claw. She had lost so much blood herself that she collapsed the moment the patient was moved onto a gurney, and when she woke up in the recovery ward 6 hours later, "Do you know what the first thing she asked?" The nurse was no one in the hallway. Spoke a young Corrigan in the back, was holding her breath. She didn't ask if she still had her arm. Carter whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She didn't ask if she was going home. She didn't ask for a medal. She asked if Senior Chief Vance was stable. And when they told her he was, she tried to get out of bed to go check his charts. She refused to sign the paperwork for a Purple Heart because she said the medal belonged to the guys who were still out there in the dirt. Lieutenant Commander Miller looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. The nurses who had joked about her size were now looking at her with a mixture of profound awe and deep shame. They didn't see a small girl anymore. They saw a warrior who had outclassed